Greetings and welcome to our presentation, Artificial Intelligence IP Considerations in Drug Discovery and Development. And now, we are delighted to turn the proceedings over to Patricia Campbell.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're just delighted to have you. We're going to do a very quick introduction of the panelists. I'll start with myself. I am a partner in intellectual property in our Jones Day Silicon Valley office. My background is medicinal chemistry. I was a medicinal chemist before I joined the practice of law. At Jones Day, I do a lot of work in the life science patent prosecution realm, primarily in the small molecule space. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaan to introduce herself.
Patricia, hi everyone. My name is Kaan. I'm also a partner in our IP practice based in Silicon Valley. I'm an IP transactions lawyer, so I spend my days negotiating collaboration and partnership agreements and doing due diligence on life science and AI technology companies.
Hi, I'm Carl Kukkonen. I'm a partner in the San Diego office. I'm an IP strategist with a focus on patent portfolio development and enforcement, and as well as tech transactions. I have an engineering background and have helped clients obtain thousands of software-oriented patents, including several hundred over machine learning and AI. Next slide, please. So I want to briefly touch on our agenda today. So we're going to start with an introduction to AI. Patricia's then going to give an overview of the AI Biopharma Revolution, as well as some of the life cycle issues. We're then going to switch over to Kaan, where she's going to talk about some of the transactional considerations for drug discovery and AI in general. And time permitting, we're also going to address patent portfolio considerations and how to develop a portfolio with regard to AI technologies. To some extent, the opposite approach or a overlapping approach might be to also consider trade secrets, and then we're going to close it out with a brief statement on what we think the future might hold. So just to orient everybody, we want to give a quick introduction to AI. So human intelligence involves the ability to analyze data, and with that analysis, you're able to reach some conclusions and make decisions, and the idea is that you're learning from that experience. So you're using all your various senses, your sight, your touch, your taste, and the like. And again, you're collecting all the information, then you're able to make some sort of decisions in the future based on those experiences. AI, the goal of AI is to do some or all of these functions. What we often hear about AI these days is machine learning. So machine learning is one technique of AI in which you're allowed to train a model, and then with the model, without actually having ever seen a new piece of data, is able to make some sort of decision about that particular piece of data. And one subset of machine learning is called deep learning. And so in deep learning, the model is set up similar to a brain in which there are a lot of connecting nodes, which they refer to as neurons or neural networks, elements, and that you're taking data, you're extracting features from that data, you're applying it to all these different nodes or neurons with different weighting elements, and then you're coming out with some sort of an output, which could be a yes or no, could be dog versus cat, could be a series of numbers. So here, as an engineer, I like a good Venn diagram. So when we think of AI, machine learning is a subset of that, and then deep learning is a subset of machine learning. If we wanted to also add on to this, related technologies are natural language processing, which maybe overlaps somewhat with AI. And that's making sense of spoken or written words and characterizing it. And then there's also computer vision, which we're not going to touch on as much today, but which again also has some overlap with regard to AI and also non-overlap with regard to AI. So when you think of machine learning, again, you have training data. So what's going to be needed, and Kaan's going to touch on some of these issues a little bit later, is you need some sort of a rich data set from which you're extracting features, which are essentially data points, which characterize what's in this training data. That's being used to train your algorithm, train your machine learning models, and then allows it to be deployed. In some cases, the data may be homegrown, and that may be something that the company develops itself. And other times it may be a third party or open source data. And so there are issues that arise with regard to the source of the training data. And there are different ways to train a model. So one is supervised learning. So if you've ever had to do a capture authentication to make sure that you're a human being, that may be training a machine learning model of some sort, and that you're tagging data of, this is a crosswalk, or these are traffic lights, or this is a freeway overpass. Unsupervised learning is one that just will cluster the underlying data and will make decisions based on similarity analyses. And then there's kind of a hybrid approach, which is a little newer, which is called reinforcement learning. And with reinforcement learning, you're kind of giving goals for the model, and then so it takes less effort than tagging all your data with supervised learning, but it is a different approach that can be taken. Next slide, please. And so here's a quick architecture diagram of what an AI model look like. So you may have I'm a patent attorney, so I'll say a plurality of data sources. And so you have data sources, which could be data feeds, it could be data objects, it could be other sources of information. You're taking features, which again, could be a numerical value, could be a part of an image, can be other things which characterize what's in that data source. You're applying it to the machine learning model. That's an example of a neural network inside, but you may start with 50 nodes and you may end up with one node, or there's different architectures that can be implemented. And then you're going to have an output. So, the output again could be a numerical value, could be a 1 or 0. It could be a recommendation, and that's, in this context, it could be to identify a particular therapeutic or drug which is applicable to a particular condition that's trying to be remedied. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Patricia to talk about the AI Biopharma Revolution.
Thanks, Carl. So I don't need to tell this audience that artificial intelligence is a big thing now in the biopharmaceutical space. But let's start with some numbers. About 50% of global healthcare companies plan to implement AI strategies by 2025. This global AI in the pharma market is expected to grow to at least $6 billion in 2025. It probably has already achieved that by the end of 2022. And it is projected that AI can help new drugs reach clinical trial stage 5 times faster while cutting down industry costs by about 30%. And this last point is really the reason why AI has become so big, because you want to get there faster and you want to get there more cheaply. So there are really 3 ways that artificial intelligence and the biopharma space can generate potentially innovative ideas, some of them patentable. The first is, and this is where Carl comes in, the software product itself. What is the algorithm? This AI software may have some level of generality or have been specifically designed to solve a technical problem. Number 2 is the application of this software to solve a specific technical problem. That's where I come in, because the specific technical problem is potentially repurposing of new drugs, or coming up with a new therapeutic, or identifying a patient subpopulation. So you're not patenting the software itself. Under number 2, you're patenting the output of the software. And number 3 is where trade secret comes in. More often than not, the training data used to train or feed the machine learning algorithm is not something that you want to protect by patent, because you want to keep it secret. So this data is usually kept as a trade secret. All right, in my realm, where you use artificial intelligence to solve a specific technical problem, let me give you some examples. So you can use AI to identify new targets and new biomarkers. You can use it to repurpose existing therapeutics. This is huge right now, because a lot of pharmaceutical companies that had developed small molecule therapeutics for the treatment of viral infections are now repurposing them to treat COVID with a fair amount of success. You can use AI to design new therapeutics or new formulations. You can use AI to validate or optimize drug candidates. And then finally, at least on this slide, but not finally in the real world, you can use AI to design clinical trials. We're going to give you some examples of designing new therapeutics and optimizing drug candidates in some of our later slides. Here are examples of 3 artificial intelligence companies, and they're really randomly chosen. I just wanted to give you a sampler of 3 companies, one in the US, that's Atomwise in the San Francisco Bay Area, one in Britain, Accenture, and one which is an American Chinese biotech company. So let's call them in China, and that's Crystal Pi. But as you probably are aware of, there's hundreds of AI companies right now. These are just 3 examples that have been in the space and have broadly partnered with biopharmaceutical companies recently. And you can see that a lot of money is being poured into these companies. Atomwise just raised $123 million in Series B financing. They have a platform, AtomNet, which uses deep learning for structure-based drug discovery. Accenture just raised $225 million in Series D financing. Their platform is called Centaur Chemist, and it's used for small molecule drug design. And Crystal Pi just recently raised $309 million in Series C financing, and their platform is, I'll just call it by its acronym, ID4, and again, it provides predictions for small molecule candidates. So you might see, you might see some consistency between these 3 companies. They're all directed to discovery and development of small molecule therapeutics. Development and discovery of biologics is still in its infancy in artificial intelligence, but we'll talk about how it can be used a little bit later in the talk. All right. There are, as I mentioned, a fair number of collaborations between artificial intelligence companies and big pharma, and these are just some examples. There are literally 50 examples I could have put on this slide, but I'm just picking and choosing to give you a sense again of the variety. Some of these partnerships have involved big deals in 2022 alone, so just in the past 2 weeks. And you can see these are big deals between Amgen and Generate Biomedicines. A major licensing deal closed in 2022 worth $1.9 billion. Sanofi and Accenture closed 3 major licensing deals just a week ago for $5.2 billion. And Merck and AbbVie closed a major licensing deal in 2022 worth $600 million. So this is where Ka-on comes in, and she's going to be speaking about this area when she gives her slides. So big money, big deals, big partnerships. All right, moving on. Let's talk about specifically how AI can be used in the life cycle of developing biopharmaceutical products. So this is taken from a scientific article from a few years back. I like this picture because it shows the timeline and it shows the costs. So for a small molecule drug, the R&D investment to come up with a new drug is in the nature of maybe $2 billion. You can take that amount and you can double it for an antibody therapeutic or for a vaccine. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. And anything that we can do to shorten the timeline for discovery, get through clinical trials more quickly, or come up with clinical candidates more quickly, that can save costs and save time, will save billions and billions of dollars. And that's why AI is such big business right now. And that's why there's so many partnerships. So the goal is to decrease attrition in the pipeline. So shorten the pipeline and narrow the pipeline. Get there faster with fewer candidates. The way that AI is being used now in the biopharmaceutical space is, varied, and really this picture doesn't even begin to capture all the ways that it can be used. But let's just focus on a few of these. So we're going to focus in this talk primarily on the drug discovery piece, which is in the blue on the right-hand side of the slide. But AI can be used, if you go at the left-hand side, the green color, the light green, for clinical trial design and monitoring. And that is an area of great interest where money is being poured in right now in the artificial intelligence space. Pharmaceutical manufacturing in the bottom there in brown is also a big area. So if you can correlate manufacturing errors to set parameters and drive your automation manufacturing. That is very useful. Pharmaceutical product development in purple there in the bottom right-hand corner. If you can select excipients, monitor development of the process, this can be very useful. And we've seen quite a few AI companies being founded and developing their own proprietary software for excipient choice. And then, there's also pharmaceutical product management and quality assurance and quality control in the green and in the red. We're going to focus on the drug discovery piece today. All right, I want to just step back and go back to Carl's original slide and remind ourselves of the AI architecture. So in the middle, we have our machine learning model. What we're showing are neural networks. The deeper the neural network, the more nodes you have in yellow. You have to train this machine learning model. You have to train the software, and you train it with your big data. So your big data could be amino acid sequences, three-dimensional structures of chemical compounds, or indeed of antibody, hypervariable loops. It could be binding data. It could be physicochemical properties, patient data, marketing analytics, etc. So you train your model, and once your model is trained so that it can recognize and properly execute on new input, then you add your input in again. And the output will be maybe a predicted chemical property. It might be an optimized pharmacophore structure. It could be the identification of new antibody sequences and patient selection for clinical trials, marketing position, if you're interested in marketing analytics. So just to remind ourselves that this is what we're using AI for. All right, let's focus on drug discovery. Well, we all know in this audience that there are really two types of drugs in the patent space. One type of drug is a small molecule, and one type of drug is a big molecule. Okay, well, they're all molecules, so they're all small. But some molecules are smaller than others. So when we talk about chemical compounds that would be synthesized at the bench by synthetic organic chemists, these would be small molecules. And so that's our cartoon that you're going to see to identify our slides when we talk about the small molecules. In the big molecule space, these are biologics like antibodies that would be made by cells, not by human hands at the bench. And these are difficult to make and they're complicated to make. And so it's really a whole new ballgame, whether we're talking about small or large, chemical or biologics. So I just want to have that kept, for that to bear in mind as we take a look at the next few slides. Okay, let's take a look at AI and drug discovery with respect to chemical compounds. And there's our cartoon on the right there for a small molecule as opposed to a slightly bigger molecule, a biologic. So AI is used for in silico screening and design, and this is an area that I have some expertise in. For example, we can use it for virtual screening. This could be structure-based, based on the structure of the compound itself, and trying to predict what it would bind to in terms of a receptor. Or it could be, ligand-based is what I was just talking about, taking a look at the compound itself and predicting what it would bind to. Or structure-based, that is taking a look at the receptor and predicting what the ligand should look like that binds to the receptor. So this is an area that I work in, and I can draw on my own experience in, when I was an NMR spectroscopist and using docking algorithms to do this sort of thing. We can also use AI for drug repurposing. And as I mentioned, this is hot now in the arena of COVID. And we can use it for QSAR modeling to come up with new compounds, new novel peptides, prediction of toxicity, bioactivity, or physicochemical properties. A very hot area is selection of potential drugs for combination therapy. Can you use AI to predict synergism or antagonism? And finally, can you use it to predict mode of action and to do ADMET analysis? So in fact, the industry has been quite successful. And let me give you some real-world examples. And these real-world examples involve one of the AI companies I mentioned previously, and that is Accenture. Remember, this is this British company that has received a lot of funding recently. And they're partnering with various companies. Here are two examples. In their partnership with Evotec, they've come up with an A2A receptor antagonist that has entered phase 1 clinical trials. In its partnership with Sumitomo Dainippon, it has developed two different compounds, and these also have been entered into phase 1 clinical trials. So the take-home message is this, that artificial intelligence in the small molecule space works. There are real-world examples of it, and these examples show that artificial intelligence indeed can come up with a therapeutic, a small molecule therapeutic that can be so successful it can enter clinical trials. So in fact, we are shortening the timeline for the pipeline to come up with small molecule therapeutics and get them into the clinic. Let's now turn to biologics. So that picture on the right, for those of you that are molecular biologists and protein chemists, you'll see a bunch of alpha helices, so we know that's not an antibody. But when we talk about biologics, we're primarily focused on antibodies. And here, artificial intelligence is in its infancy. So there are companies that are focused on this, but nothing yet has been developed that has entered into even phase 1 clinical trials yet. But we'll get there. We'll get there. So we can use artificial intelligence, again, for in silico prediction and design. This could be homology or ab initio modeling. There's been a fair amount of interest in using AI to model the antibody H3 loop, which you will know if you're in this space is very important in antigen recognition and binding. And in fact, I'm going to give you an example. It's just an academic example, but it's an interesting one on the next slide of the use of AI for optimization of an H3 loop. That's why I have the little red arrow beside that. We can also use AI for docking to predict the docked conformational state and for epitope mapping to map B cell or T cell epitopes. So let me give you an academic example that came from a publication from last year. So if you remember again the architecture of artificial intelligence, you have an input, you have your machine learning algorithm with its nodes, and you have your output. Well, you have to train your algorithm. So in this case, you're going to train it, or they trained it in this paper, with a relatively small number of variants, so 50,000 trastuzumab generated variants with introduced mutations in the H3 loop. And they screened it for binding against the target antigen HER2. All right, so that's what they used to train the algorithm. And the algorithm then analyzed that data, and it identified those that bound and those that didn't bound. So it was trained now. Now as your input, you can computer generate 7.2 times 10 to the 7 candidate sequences. That's your input to your trained algorithm. Your output then was an order of magnitude less. So 3.1 times 10 to the 6 predicted binders. And if you randomly selected 30 of these, 30 of them, so 30 out of 30, showed specific binding to the antigen HER2 with a 3 times increase in affinity. So that's a big result. So this means that machine learning can produce a subset of new binding sequences that is an order of magnitude smaller. So you're shortening the pipeline than the actual expected binding sequence space. So you went from 10 to the 7 to 10 to the 6. And then you're not done. So at that point, then the predicted binders were then subjected to several sequence-based in silico filtering steps, which themselves can be subjected to machine learning to optimize for such properties as viscosity, clearance, solubility, etc., generating at the end of the day 8,000 antibody sequences. And these were de novo antibody sequences. So this paper, while just academic, shows that actually, artificial intelligence can work in the biologic space. All right, I'm going to touch on these very briefly. AI can be used for formulation design, coming up with new excipients, for monitoring and modifying manufacturing process. So you can predict, for example, the possible path of tablets in the coding process. It can be used in clinical trial design and monitoring, both for the clinical trial design piece itself, for the patient selection, recruitment and enrollment, for the investigator and site selection, and for the patient monitoring, adherence, and retention. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaan so she can tell us all about, how AI is used in these big deals. All yours, Kaan.
Thanks, Patricia. So if you're an IP transactions attorney or an attorney asked to do some IP transactions working for a pharmaceutical company, you might be asked to work on a few projects. So just going on to the next slide. Thanks, Patricia. So you might be asked to conduct due diligence on an AI company that your pharmaceutical company is interested in investing in, acquiring, or collaborating with. And of course, if you work for an AI company, you might be asked to prepare for that type of due diligence conducted by a pharmaceutical company. Or you might be asked to help negotiate a partnership agreement with an AI company, a collaboration, partnership, licensing deal. And so I'm going to briefly touch on these two topics. Next slide, thanks. So due diligence. So if you're a pharmaceutical company working for a pharmaceutical company, thinking about partnering with, investing, or acquiring an AI company, from an IP transactional perspective, first you want to understand what IP the company relies on. What is the critical IP that the company owns? Whether it's registered IP, so patents, registered copyrights, software, data, and also to understand what third-party IP the company's technology relies on as well, whether it's software or data as well, or patents too. And then after understanding the IP that the company relies on, then you want to diligence the relevant agreements to ensure that the company has adequately protected the IP that they own and they have adequate license rights to use the third-party IP that they rely on. And depending on whether the IP is owned or third-party IP, third-party owned IP, the company's interests in each category will be protected and addressed in different agreements. So first, owned IP. So that's technology or data that is homegrown or developed by the company's contractors or employees. So first, you want to make sure that the company has adequate IP assignment agreements or agreements with adequate IP provisions that assign to the company the IP developed by its employees and contractors. And of course, that means that IP assignment agreement should have present tense assignment of IP rights, including software developed by these employees or contractors to the company. And most of you are probably already familiar with due diligence in that area. If there are any issues identified with any employees or contractors who haven't signed adequate IP assignment agreements, then you probably want to get those issues remediated before the close of the deal. And so for current employees or contractors who haven't signed proper IP assignment agreements, you want the company to procure that those employees and contractors sign confirmatory IP assignment agreements. If we're talking about former employees or contractors, then it's important to understand what software, data, or other IP was developed by those folks. You want to understand how material that software or data is. And if it is material, then instead of procuring that those former employees or contractors sign IP assignment agreements, it might be a more practical solution to just remove the software or data going forward so the company no longer relies on that software. The other types of agreements you'll want to review are obviously the company's licenses, collaboration agreements, and other third-party agreements to ensure that the company hasn't inadvertently given some of its IP away to its partners or customers, making sure that they haven't agreed to provisions that restrict their ability to use their IP going forward. Their agreements with your competitors should receive the most scrutiny. If you're buying or wanting to collaborate with an AI company and that company has already partnered with one of your competitors, or one of your competitors is an existing investor, then look out for provisions that might give that competitor a right to stop your acquisition or collaboration, that might give them a right of first refusal when it comes to acquisitions or future partnerships, or give them some other preferential rights. Also, look at the agreements to see what rights your competitor has with respect to your field of use that your company is interested in. So has the AI company assigned their IP in your field of use to your competitor? Have they exclusively licensed that IP to your competitor? Or have they just given your competitor non-exclusive rights to IP in your field of use, such that if you do end up investing, buying, or collaborating with this AI company, are you thereby enabling your competitor in your field of use by contributing IP to the bucket that your competitor gets a non-exclusive license to? And finally, think about what's likely going to happen under that agreement that you're reviewing if you end up buying or collaborating with the AI company. Will your competitor have termination or opt-out rights? So now third-party owned technology and data. So the AI company's platform might rely on third-party software and data, especially training data, as mentioned by both Carl and Patricia, to feed the machine learning algorithms. Some of that data might be public, what they call public data, and some of the software that they use might be open source software. When they use the term, if the AI company uses the term public data, kind of red flag, what does public data mean? Where did they get that data? Just because they don't provide license terms, just because license terms do not exist, that doesn't mean the data is in the public domain or that they can rely on fair use or an implied license. You want to be cautious. If they say that there's no license governing their use of the software or the data, if possible, it should be up to the company to get written permission from the relevant owner of the software or data to use it. Or if it's too risky to approach the owner, the best course might just be stop using the software or data in some instances. They might also be relying on commercial third-party software or data, so that's software or data that they've paid for. And so for that type of software or data, you should be reviewing the relevant agreements that govern their use of that software or data. So when reviewing these types of agreements, there are a number of issues that you would be reviewing these agreements for. And I'm going to focus on data license agreements or data access agreements here, especially agreements under which the AI company is licensing training data from a third party. So the first question I normally ask myself is, what type of data are we talking about? Is it patient data? That was one of the categories of data that Patricia talked about before. Obviously, if it's personal data, if it's medical data, clinical data, healthcare data, it's going to be jurisdiction specific. Is HIPAA brought into the mix? CCPA, all of that fun, cybersecurity, all of those issues should be addressed as well. Who owns the data? So the raw data will normally be owned by the licensor, the party that provides the data to the AI company, but who owns the derived data? So we often see drafting gaps around who owns data derived from the raw data. So if the contract is silent on who owns the derived data, then you run into potential issues because copyright and patent protection of data and derivatives of data isn't necessarily guaranteed. You'll also look at the agreement for the restrictions on how the company uses the licensed data. Are they required to use the data in accordance with their privacy policy? Can they only use the data in the identified form? Are they prohibited from altering, decompiling, or aggregating, or creating derivative works of the data? If the company is obtaining training data, then the company will probably want to alter, decompile, and aggregate the data and create derivative works and own the data as well to make sure that the company has rights to do all those things as well. And last, who bears the risk arising from the company's use of the data, that the relevant consents have been obtained if personal data is being licensed. Next slide, thanks. So that's due diligence, which I ran through very quickly, and now I'm going to run through very quickly collaboration agreements and licensing agreements in the AI pharmaceutical space. I'll skip this slide since Patricia has already talked about some example collaboration and partnership deals in this space. So we've looked at and negotiated a lot of these types of agreements, and they're quite different to the traditional pharmaceutical partnership and collaboration agreements, drug development agreements that we have seen in the past. In this space, in the AI pharmaceutical space, the agreements are a bit different in a number of respects. So first, and these are just some kind of observations that I would like to share when it comes to these agreements. So the nature of the contributions are a little bit different. So pharmaceutical companies are normally contributing some clinical data, they're contributing expertise because they've been around for much longer than the AI companies normally. They're contributing experience, money, that's similar to the traditional collaboration agreement in the pharmaceutical space. Sometimes they're contributing materials as well, like compounds. The AI companies, who are normally startups, are contributing their AI-enabled drug discovery platforms or some other AI platform. They might be contributing third-party data. And most importantly, they're contributing AI machine learning talent. So data scientists, software engineers, data engineers. And as a result of those contributions, we're finding that the AI companies have a lot more leverage when it comes to negotiating these agreements, because the pharmaceutical companies are increasingly competing for AI talent. And as a result, they're competing for partnerships as well. Due to the convergence of the pharmaceutical industry and Silicon Valley, this means there are more pressures to fail quickly and succeed quickly. So we're seeing more milestones, more carrots and sticks when it comes to R&D milestones. And almost all of the collaborations that we've been working on have some type of equity component involved. These collaboration deals are now being driven not just by the R&D departments of pharmaceutical companies, but we're working really closely with the corporate development teams of the pharmaceutical companies who are seeing these AI startups not just as IP generators or outsourced IT departments, but also potential acquisition targets as well, which affects the dynamics of the negotiations and the drafting. And last slide for IP transactions. The last thing I wanted to talk about was how the carrots and sticks, the incentives and disincentives have changed when it comes to AI pharmaceutical collaborations. The traditional incentives to keep your partner aligned with your goals and the traditional disincentives to prevent them from reaching their obligations are a bit less common in the AI pharma deals. So, for example, the traditional carrot of the promise of entering into a long-term supply agreement with minimum order commitments isn't as applicable in these deals. What we're seeing instead when it comes to incentives are more incentive payments provided to the AI company for hitting important research and development milestones. And the milestone payments are very much heavily negotiated because we're trying to achieve the balance between achievability of the milestones and adequate incentives for the company to reach those milestones. instead of the promise of entering into supply agreements, it's the promise of entering into future licensing agreements. So not just one-off licenses to obtain the pharmaceuticals clinical data, but ongoing rights to license the pharmaceuticals clinical data as that data set grows. So that's one method of keeping the AI company kind of incentivized and aligned to your company if they rely on your clinical data on a going forward basis, not just on a one-off basis. And finally, as I mentioned before, being a substantial investor or having a seat on the company's board will also drive behavior as well. When it comes to disincentives in these agreements, the traditional disincentive of the traditional stick of potentially terminating the agreement is a little bit less effective in AI deals. It's not going to be as effective in AI pharmaceutical deals because if the pharmaceutical company terminates, the AI company is going to have their eggs in the baskets of other pharmaceutical companies, or they'll have a line of pharmaceutical companies waiting to partner with them. So termination is less common, is a less effective weapon in these agreements. So instead, what we're seeing are clawbacks. So we've seen clawbacks as a more common stick in these agreements. If the AI company misses an important milestone, then the pharmaceutical company might have a right to claw back a percentage of funds provided to the AI company. A creative way is also if the clawback is in the form of preferred shares at a pre-agreed discount, say a 30% discount. And finally, we've also seen liquidated damages if you can get away with it. The AI company probably knows that your last resort will be to sue them if they breach the agreement. You're unlikely going to want to sue them since you're the big company. If you're known in the industry for suing your partners, it'll be very difficult for you to partner with AI companies going forward. So instead, liquidated damages to pre-agree the amount of damages that you might suffer if they breach the agreement, and also springing licenses to the partner's IP if they, for example, walk away from the relationship in breach of the agreement as well.
Thank you, Kaan. Now we're going to briefly touch on patent portfolio considerations. Next slide, please. So with pharma and other life science patent strategy, the timing of your patent filings are often as late as possible so that you can extend the term and expiration as far out in the future as possible. Whereas AI is frankly a quickly evolving technology, and many of the technologies and models and other techniques which are being used are going to be obsolete well before 20 years. So despite all this, some companies are taking the approach of filing often and quickly. There is a bit of a mentality that there's a land rush to file AI patents across different industries, including life sciences and drug discovery. We have some clients which, again, are filing AI patents quickly. They're seeking prioritized examinations, so you may get an office action within a few months, and maybe even an issued patent within 6 to 8 months of the initial filing date, which is maybe, the opposite of a typical pharma approach where you're going to file a provisional on the 1-year anniversary, you're going to file a utility and maybe try to slow roll it as the development of that drug progresses in R&D. And then also, unlike maybe a leading drug candidate patent portfolio, which you're going to file in every major country across the world, AI patents may be a little bit more limited geographically. You may file only in the U.S. If you file only in the U.S., you can do a non-publication request, but it may be the U.S., maybe Europe, and maybe 1 or 2 Asian countries is what we see a lot of clients focusing on with regard to their AI innovations. So I'm going to touch on trade secrets in a little bit. One of the big factors is whether or not to file a patent on any particular aspect of your AI workflow. So, when we go to that diagram that I think we showed earlier, is it next slide, Patricia? Let me see, one more. Oh, sorry, we'll go back. But anyways, So the AI architecture can be very complex, and so you may have various data sources, like Kaan said, some of them may be a publicly available database, some of the, if you're looking at natural language processing, a lot of people train their models, for example, using Wikipedia. But you're going to look at, what are the data sources and what are the features? So what are the elements that are being extracted from those sources? Which machine learning models are being used? I think most of our examples were simplified above in that they were a single machine learning model, but there may be an ensemble of machine learning models. Each of those outputs may be used in combination by yet another machine learning model or a other statistical analysis to end with, the result, which might be a candidate target, maybe something else. And then, again, we worry about how is that output of those machine learning models ultimately consumed. And so if the innovation relates to some of this fine tuning and it's going to be very difficult to identify an infringer, then that maybe weighs against filing patents. Some things, again, we still see clients filing patents on the entire AI workflow or different aspects of it. There is a bit of a land rush mentality. Candidate innovations that are, more frequently filed on are ones that are consumer facing. So, if you have some sort of a diagnostic, which maybe includes images and you're overlaying, taking a scan of a body part and then trying to make some characterization over, is there cancer in the lung or and the like. Those are things that people are more likely to file on because it's easier to identify infringers. The converse is, is this a new advanced technique for more efficiently training a machine learning model? Could be very valuable for the company, with a smaller data set, but it may be something that's going to be very difficult to identify, and ultimately down the road if there's infringement or not. And so you may have a very valuable patent covering valuable innovation, but it's, I guess it's not valuable in that you can't enforce it or unlikely to enforce it. Not only are you going to face 101 or patent subject matter eligibility issues within the patent office, but you may also have challenges with regard to enforcement. IPRs are not available for 101 challenges, but they are available for post-grant review. Similar to foreign opposition proceedings, this needs to be done within 9 months of issuance. And so we do have some clients which are selectively monitoring some competitors' AI patent portfolios as a issue for these purposes. One thing to note that the USPTO on February 1st launched a new pilot program, or it will be launching a new pilot program. So in developing a portfolio, if you have a subject matter eligibility rejection as well as prior art rejections, you have the ability to defer the 101 rejections until the other issues are resolved. We'll see if that has any real significant impact. And maybe that, sometimes you can kick the can with regard to 101 and work on getting allowable subject matter with regard to prior art, and then often 101 goes away. But we'll see what happens. It could be that we have more rapid examination of patent applications, which could benefit all of our clients. So yeah, again, here it's the complex nature of AI makes it difficult to identify infringement. And then you may also have issues with regard to what we call divided infringement or split infringement. And so the data sources may be provided by one entity, the machine learning models may be provided by yet another entity, and then the output and how that output is used may be used by another entity. And so in crafting claims, you want to make sure that you have different points of view so that you can capture infringing activity, hopefully by a single party, even though there may be multiple parties involved. We're going to touch on trade secrets briefly, and then I'm going to hand it off to Patricia to close us out as we're getting close to the hour. As a patent attorney, I'm often heavily biased towards patents, but I know that in many cases, trade secrets are more appropriate. So again, it could be the raw data that's being used by the models, how that information is being extracted. So there may be even new techniques on how you're extracting that data. How the models are generated. Do you have an ensemble of models? How are you training them? What is the output of those models? How is it being used? And then, certainly machine learning models are often considered algorithms, but they may be part of a larger algorithm, which is utilizing the output of those models in some fashion. It could be in silico screening. could be other aspects with regard to the drug discovery life cycle. So, in order for, these are the basics, but in order to prove that something constitutes a trade secret, you have to show that the information was secret, that has some economic value, and you actually had to make reasonable efforts to keep the information secret. So if your training data set is from a public database, and you're trying to maintain the types of features you're extracting from that public database, that may be difficult to demonstrate that that's a trade secret. Hasn't been litigated yet in the courts as far as I know, but those are things to keep in mind with regard to what is the source of the data and also what's being done to keep it secret. Trade secrets, as people can appreciate, can be possibly indefinite in scope if secrecy is maintained. Patents have a limited term. With regard to licensing, you can license your trade secrets for beyond the 20 years of a patent term, and there's no trade-off with regard to public disclosure with trade secrets. You can keep your inventions secret. You can't necessarily reverse engineer what's in your trade secret. In a patent, you have to disclose everything. In trade secrets, if it's hard to reverse engineer, it might weigh in favor of a trade secret. Patents are often easier for investors to quantify as opposed to trade secrets, but both patents and trade secrets are expensive and costly to litigate. However, monetary relief is often easier with regard to trade secrets once you've identified misappropriation. I hand it back to Patricia to close us out.
Thanks, Carl. So before we go to what the future holds, I just thought it would be useful to make it clear that, once again, if we think about the three areas of potential innovation in the artificial intelligence sphere, we're talking about the algorithm itself and everything that Carl has been talking about in terms of split infringement, 101, potentially difficult to identify infringers, etc. That applies to the algorithm. The second piece was, what is the product of the algorithm, the new therapeutic, as an example. So all the old rules for patentability of composition of matter, formulations, that applies there. The only way that we see that artificial intelligence potentially intersects with patent law for these new therapeutics is in identifying who the inventor is. And just wanted to make a note that there have been a fair number of cases involving an invention by a machine learning algorithm, so-called DABUS, around the world. Most patent offices have come to the conclusion that the algorithm itself cannot be the inventor. There are a couple of exceptions, South Africa and Australia being those exceptions. But in general, if you take a look at the product of the artificial intelligence algorithm, the new patient subpopulation, the new therapeutic, the new formulation, the same old rules for patentability apply. It's just when you're looking at the algorithm that you have to think in the ways that, that Carl has just outlined. Okay, well, let's finish here with what the future holds. So it's pretty clear that artificial intelligence is going to be key in the future for the discovery and development of new drugs. And by new drugs, we both mean small molecule, chemical compounds, and large molecule biologics. It may create cures for complex and rare diseases and could tackle known diseases with no cure. So there's a lot of neurological disorders that are the site of the focus of a lot of intellectual property development and therapeutics, and artificial intelligence could be helpful in this regard. AI can be used for better treatment and management of rare diseases, could improve drug adherence and dosage, could lead to faster and better analytics of clinical data, identifying patient subpopulations, finding more reliable patients faster for clinical trials, those patients that are likely to be treatable, for example. And as we've seen from Kaon's piece of the talk and my earlier pieces, more collaborations, more and more of them between AI and life science companies. And we're going to see more AI-enabled biotech startups, more investments, and more M&A activity. So the future is bright. If you're an AI company and if you're a biopharmaceutical company, you want to get with the program and get involved in partnerships with AI and explore this new opportunity. And then to finish up, let's open this up for questions. I don't know whether this is the right format because I don't know how many people we have attending, but if you would like, you can unmute yourself and we've got 2 minutes to answer your question. Or Carl, Kaan, and I would be delighted if you reached out to us separately by email. You have our email addresses from the first slide. And please ask us your questions. We'd be happy to answer anything that you might have for us.
There's one question. So to what extent does having partnerships with AI companies who want to improve their platforms and work with competitors change the desirability of patent versus trade secret protection?
I'll take a stab and then I might turn it over to Carl. I think it depends on what is being protected. If it is the training set, trade secret is probably the way to go. If it's the algorithm itself or the product of the algorithm, it's going to be, desirable for that to be protected as always by patent. Carl, don't know whether you had a couple comments you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with regard to the partnership, having patents is always helpful with regard to the inventory of who owns what prior to going into the relationship. And I think that if you're either the AI company or you're the partnering company, if you have a patent on some technique, I think that's going to increase your leverage with regard to the negotiation of who ultimately owns the output of, this collaboration, or what are the IP license terms and who owns what, and having patents, versus trade secrets, I think it will increase, in many cases, will benefit the patent holder in those type of negotiations.
So if you have any questions, again, we really invite you to reach out to us separately. It's been really delightful to have the opportunity to present to you today. And I think that's the end of our presentation. So many thanks to Kaan, who's presenting from Australia today. So it's 4 a.m. in Australia. So thanks, Kaan. And that's it for today.